All right, so last time we started to try to lay out the main things that get in the way of authentic expression. Authenticity being the ability to act for the sake of what one truly desires and to come to know the fullest truth of oneself that one can. And we talked about about a few things that get in the way of this. Um, the main one being the needs of survival. The more time and energy and resources and effort that we have to devote to maintaining our survival, the less we have time to pursue the things that we actually value, meaning the ends in themselves rather than just the means to the ends. And we talked about how this is kind of a modifiable and reducible, but at the end of the day, inescapable aspect of human existence. We have to spend a certain amount of time creating the conditions for life because only within life is the manifestation of values possible. We talked about existential limits to authenticity, meaning there are things that we desire, there are ends in themselves that we might imagine or wish we could achieve, but there are existential limits on our ability to achieve that. And I think the example we gave was something like, wanting to play in um, the NBA or something like that, but being either physically or uh, being limited in some way by your body or by um, your just innate capacities that actually limit your ability to pursue what it is that you actually value. Um, Meaning that our ideas of what we want, even if they were authentic in the sense that when they were manifested, they actually produced value to us, they can outstrip our capacity to actually achieve them just because of the limits of the world themselves. And so the needs of survival, somewhat modifiable, but still inescapable, it seems, to one degree or another. Existen- Existential limits. There's a relationship between, what it is they actually value and the existential. So what actually limits you from the existential depends on the person and their circumstances. So highly subjective, but also kind of inescapable. We talked about force and how the use of force against somebody um, limits their authenticity, their ability to act for the sake of what they value. And we talked about the two different kinds of forces. So there's sort of natural force, something like a tornado that rips through your home, destroying your ability to live within that home and to pursue, whatever values you wanted to pursue that were a part of having a home, right? And then we also talked about human force, voluntary or volitional force, in which another person uses force against you or another person, and quite literally physically forces them to act against what they value. So if somebody threatens you with bodily harm or death if you don't give them your wallet, for instance, you don't want to give them your wallet and you don't want to die, but they force you to choose between these two artificial choices, and artificial because they've imposed them on you. You neither want to die or receive bodily harm, nor do you want to give the wallet, but some other person has now created the situation for you, and now you are forced to act against your values. And this is not an existential limitation. This is not a survival limitation necessarily. This is not a natural base force, but this is volitional force coming from another human being. And we talked about how essentially all of these different limitations on our authenticity relate to the same kind of thing, which is, well, sorry, we talked about how the use of force, whether it's from nature or whether it's from individuals, ultimately comes down to the same kind of thing where it prevents you from acting for the sake of what you actually value. And the reason why we comply with a robber, for instance, is because we know that we have to maintain our lives and maintain a certain bodily function in order to act for the sake of our own values, um, regardless of circumstances. And so we are willing to put up with a temporary inability to be authentic for the sake of maintaining the potential to be authentic in the future. And then I tried to relate all of these different concepts down to the situation of the child, which in my eyes contributes this sort of um, inbuilt psychological barrier to authenticity that we often see. And I think we often struggle with in ways that are invisible or hidden. And I don't think I fully talked about the mechanisms there, but if I can remember what I talked about in the last video, I'll try to sum it up here and then continue to expand on how this limits our authenticity. But essentially, the child is born with their own instinctual values. They haven't quite learned what actually makes them happy. They haven't quite learned what actually allows them to achieve their values, and they're not even explicitly or consciously aware of what they value, right? But they do sort of towards what act instinctively towards what they think is going to produce value for them, right? And at the same time, um, because of a long history of evolutionary conditioning, they know or they act instinctively for their own self preservation. And this is reflected principally in their relationship with their parents. For you and I, our relationship to survival is one of where we have to go out and cooperate with other people and to be able to get the resources that we need in order to live and to eat and to just gain access to the kinds of resources we need to survive day to day, right? And so our survival is, it's somewhat dependent on ourselves and what we can do ourselves, but it's also dependent on our social network and whether or not we can cooperate successfully with the people, with many different people around us, right? But the child's survival, from the perspective of the child, is that their survival is dependent on whether or not they can receive love and care from principally their parents, secondarily their family, and thirdly, um, the people around them. But it is principally their parents that they rely on for their own survival. Not only because they don't actually have the ability to sort of go out and hunt or plant or gather or labor. Um, so not only that they are physically dependent on their parents, but they're also intellectually and emotionally dependent on their parents to not only get them the resources they need to sustain themselves, like through their maturation, but also give them the social abilities and the intellectual capacities and the skills and the various resources that they need to eventually become independent like you and I. So their dependence on their parents is not simply physical, though that's a huge part of it, of course, but it is also future. It's also about the future. It's about what do I need to get from and learn from my parents in order to navigate the world that I am going to be living in the future. And their parents and their direct family are their best and closest um, representation of what the wider world is going to look like, and they actually use that in order as sort of a foundation for their understanding of the world to come. Eventually, they'll learn other things, but that's their foundation. And what is also unique about this relationship between the child and the parent, with the child's dependence for life with the parents, is that survival doesn't necessarily come in a neutral way, meaning that the child often has to change how they express themselves and what they say and what they do and what they think in order to receive the love and care of their parents. Their parents' love and care is conditional on how the child behaves and expresses themselves. And this is the more true the further we go back in time. And in fact, sometimes the child's survival can come down to the way that they look. And again, this is more extreme the more we go back in history. And there is I don't know how much I can talk about this on YouTube. So I'm going to give like a detailed account that maybe I'll put up on my Substack. And if you're interested in that, you can watch it there. And then I'm going to give maybe a more YouTube friendly way of talking about this here. Okay, let's try to do the YouTube friendly version of this. The further you go back in history, the more violence was used against children in order to get them to do what the parents needed them to do so that the family could survive. Families could not control, oftentimes, how many kids they could have, and they often had children in order to contribute to the work that the family needed to do in order to survive. So if a family lived on a farm, for example, oftentimes the family would have more and more kids so that they could use them as laborers for the crops and the animals and the things needed to survive. And that was really the purpose of having kids. And a lot of times, but also if you had too many kids, you might outpopulate the resources that you have at your disposal, and you would have to, for lack of a better phrasing, get rid of the excess children in one way or another. And not only that, but what you wanted out of your children was compliance. You needed your children to do what it is that you said. And again, using the example of the father of the farmer, I need Timmy to help me work the fields and tend to the animals and to help me maintain the house and all this other kind of stuff. And if Timmy doesn't do this and he's a drag on resources, and in fact he could threaten the lives of the whole family, because if the crop fails or the animals get sick or the house, falls into disrepair, then this can endanger the entire family. And so, the father would go out and oftentimes use violent force to get the child to comply with whatever the father needed the child to do in order to survive. And this happened generation after generation after generation. And the first kinds of children that a family would get rid of oftentimes were the children who were either physically unattractive or deformed, or disobedient, chronically disobedient. And so for thousands and thousands of years, there was this psychoevolutionary pressure on the child. And the psychoevolutionary pressure was this: one, babies in particular became cute, and children in particular became cuter and cuter. And the primary reason was that it's hard to get rid of a child who is cute. It sort of signals this desire to care in adults for the children, the more cute they are. In fact, you can kind of see this replicated with the way that animals are being domesticated. A lot of times what animals are doing in the domestication process is they are becoming more and more, they are mimicking signals that we get from babies and children in order to sort of trigger that sense of the desire to care. Like, we have much greater desire to care for a puppy than we do like a beetle. There are obviously variations, but we have a greater impulse to care for a puppy than a beetle, because a puppy is more similar in mimicking the signals for care that we find cute in a child. And so physiologically, the baby um, developed over time to provoke that kind of reaction in us so that we wouldn't get rid of it in a time of famine or a time of stress. Because the first child that you would get rid of in these circumstances were the ones who were not attractive or were deformed, right? But alongside that physiological development was a psychoevolutionary development. And the psychoevolutionary development in the child was the development of compliance. And again, this is not perfect compliance that developed in children, just like perfect beauty didn't develop in physiologically, but enough compliance, enough desire in the child, or enough, not even desire, but necessarily enough willingness to comply with the parents' dictates so that the child would not be deemed useless and would be kept around. Because the children who were disobedient, the children who were rebellious, the children who endangered the family by, going after what they wanted rather than what the family needed, these were the children that were left behind. These were the children that were often gotten rid of. And so, again, the psychoevolutionary um, framework began to develop, again, on the instinctual, not the explicit, but on the instinctual level, where the child knows that the parents are the source of their life, not just their physical life, not just their future life, but also their life in the very moment, meaning that parents are entirely capable of doing some pretty horrific things to children if they are not compliant enough with what the parents demand. And I know that today we look at a situation like that and we're horrified because we live in a world that is post Enlightenment. We live in a world where there is at least some protections for children. There is an emphasis on children's rights. But for most of our social history, these concepts weren't there. These kinds of protections weren't there. Children weren't even necessarily looked at as children. And so the kind of environment that child's psychology has developed in is to be sensitive to the demands and desires of the parents and to be sensitive to what the parents need the child to become in order to satisfy them, right? So the child is constantly in a position of saying, okay, and again, implicitly, not explicitly, or kind of on an instinctual level. I'm just representing it here conceptually, but saying to themselves, okay, what do I need to become in order to get love and care from my parents, right? And it doesn't mean like the child then automatically becomes this just perfectly compliant child for the sake of the parents. They do enough to get the basic love and care that they need so that their life isn't threatened and they don't believe their parents will actively harm them in some way. And this creates this inauthentic dynamic, meaning that the child represses whatever part of themselves or represses to some degree, to a functional degree, whatever parts, instincts, emotions, thoughts, behaviors, desires, whatever is offensive to, in particular, their parents, but also their direct family, and then also their broader social circle. They repress what is actually authentically instinctive to them, regardless of whether it's good or bad or the moral judgments involved there. But they will repress that and express themselves in greater compliance with their parents. And this happens even today, as I'm sure most people kind of experience this on one level or another in their family. They just aren't necessarily explicitly aware of it. And parents a lot of parents are very direct in the way that they try to shape children through various kinds of threats, intimidations, punishments, innuendos, all these kinds of things. But um, like the environment has become more free, or the environment has become more authentically oriented for the parent and the child. But the evolutionary psychology of the child remains the same. And so even if the parent does absolutely everything they can to allow the child to act authentically in the world, there's still going to be this incentive for the child to understand what it is the parent likes and wants out of them, whether the parent is actually forcing this on them or not. It's going to come through their body language. It's going to come through the language that they use. It's going to come through the customs that, no matter how good the parent is at allowing the child to be free, the child is still going to pick up on what the parent wants out of them. And they are going to change themselves in subtle ways. And I mean change themselves in terms of their behaviors and their outward expression and their internal image of themselves. Because essentially it is easier to operate on the internal image than it is to constantly try to switch back and forth between the authentic personality and the inauthentic personality. One example I would give here is, if you have a child who grows up in a very religious household, right? And her parents teach her about God, and the parents are, they're all about God, they're all about whatever their religion dictates, right? And they punish the child if they break the rules of their religion, and they reinforce the reality of this God, and they make this very plain to the child through explanation and punishment and threats of punishment, that if they don't believe in this God and they don't follow the rules of this God, then the parents are going to withhold things, punish them, threaten them, etc., right? Disapprove, right? It is easier for the child, even if the child has no experience with this God, even if the child has absolutely no authentic belief in the God and no authentic desire to go along with the religious rules, their internal self-image, meaning how they think about themselves, is still going to reflect this belief in God and this belief in these religious rules, because it's easier to project an internal self-image to the parents and to the people around you than it is for the child to constantly context switch between the part the part of them that genuinely doesn't believe in this and the part that either is curious about it or actually has some belief in them. And so not only the internal self, this internal self-image begins to develop that is in compliance with the rules and the desires and I guess you could say, the social norms of the parents themselves. And this is what you would call the development of the false self. And the false self is just whatever I need to be in order to survive. And for the child, that is very much focused on the parents. And that childhood false self development sticks with one largely intact for quite a long time. Again, depending on for some people, it can last their entire life. But that false self-image sticks around a lot. It eventually does get modified a bit by peers and the degree to which a person later in life actually pursues their own authenticity. But the self-image is the false self, in the sense that it doesn't actually represent the child's instinctual, authentic emotions, feelings, desires, and values, but rather what it needs to become or to be or not to be in order to get the love and care of the parents. And so the false self it's usually one of three things, right? It is a value that is not inherent to the child, like believing in God or valuing God, tacked onto the child in order to get love and care from the parents. It is the repression of some value that they have. So, if they want to, I don't know, Timmy wants to be an artist, right? But Timmy has to go work the fields. Then Timmy doesn't express his artistic interests, or he kind of hides it. And his self-image is around that artistic instinct in some way being dangerous or bad. So this gets cut off from himself. And then there's also the third thing that can happen is amplification. So sometimes people get a trait, or children have an authentic trait that is particularly praised by their parents or by their society around them. And then they are sort of incentivized or forced to amplify the expression of that value far beyond what their authentic desire craves. So, like, a child might, for all intents and purposes, be really interested in playing the piano. But they start playing the piano, and let's say they actually have a talent for it, they enjoy it, they keep pursuing it. But, they live in a society or where being able to play the piano is highly praised. And their parents start pushing more and more of the piano beyond what the child actually wants to do. And maybe the child wants to go explore something else or do something else, but now everything gets focused in on the piano, and their self-identity, their self-image gets wrapped up in the piano at the cost of the rest of their personality. So this is a very complex formation. And this is why later on in life, it's so difficult to sort of tease apart, like, what of myself is authentic and what isn't. I can even given a in in the spirit of authenticity, I can give a personal example here where intelligence was something that was praised a lot when I was a kid, right? And so the part of myself that has to do with, like, whatever I socially attach to intelligence, like reading and writing and philosophy and things like I'm doing right now, there was a point in my life when that became my entire personality. And, at the cost of everything else, at the cost of, like, other silly things like dancing, right? Like, I actually really like to dance, but there was a part of myself who was kind of thought of that as like, oh, it's a non-intellectual or kind of silly. Like, everything kind of has to be profound, everything has to be intellectual. And there was a part of me when I was younger that was sort of consumed by that personality. And it was confusing when I first started to kind of dive into these things and tease these different things in myself apart, to realize that, intelligence and philosophy and profundity and all these kinds of things, while they were not inauthentic in and of themselves, there was a degree that which I genuinely enjoyed. Um, they were it was amplified so much in my personality as a response to I had been incentivized to sort of pursue. So there's just some of the dynamics, I guess, between the parent-child relationship. But I guess what I want to do is highlight that the fundamental dynamic, putting in very simple terms, the child, in order to secure love and care from the parents, changes who they are and changes how they express themselves and changes how they view themselves in order to conform more closely with whatever they perceive their parents' expectations for them to be. And the more that parents use force and violence and intimidation and threats and punishment to get that um, out of their child, the more intentionally they're doing it, so to speak, the more the child radically changes themselves. But even if the parents take a completely a peaceful parenting approach, and they focus on helping the child to understand who they are and live that out and embody that, they will still develop a degree of false selfness, because of the innate nature of the parent-child relationship and the psychoevolutionary history that the child is coming out of. And there are other waves of this that go on. The most fundamental is the parent-child, but later on, the opposite dynamic happens between the teenager and the parent, where the teenager sort of comes to the realization that their parents don't even embody the values that they themselves were forced to embody, and will rebel in some degree against the authority of their parents. And this is where, like, the skepticism comes in, and people say this is where children try to become independent, or teenagers try to become independent. And it is and it isn't. It's mostly about the teenager changing the source of the inauthentic values that they're going to take on. Um, they recognize the hypocrisy of their own parents. They oftentimes have anger around that because they were punished and forced to take on the values of their parents. but their parents often don't even express those values themselves, and yet the parents are not punished, and oftentimes the values themselves are empty, and so there's this sort of anger and nihilism and skepticism that isn't made explicitly aware because there's no conversation about inauthenticity. There's not even awareness that a false self has been created. So all this emotion sort of goes underground. It gets expressed in all these rebellious acts, and the teenager knows that the values of their parents are no longer satisfactory for getting what they want out of life, but they're not turning to their true selves. They start turning to their peers instead, and their peers and society, not like the wider society, but the society of their peer group becomes the standard of the good, the standard of what is actually valuable to pursue. They're not making this they're not starting this inward reflection on who they are and trying to understand who they are. They are now experimenting with the values that are reflected in their their wider social peer group. And this actually prepares them for the even greater conformity in adulthood where they start to conform to the broader society in general. So not just their peer group, but the broader society in general. But each stage is just another transformation of the same inauthentic values riding underneath while obscuring the authentic values underneath and the exploration of the authentic values underneath. And the reason why that internal exploration very rarely happens, because again, people can go through this in their entire lives and die incredibly unfulfilled and inauthentic and unhappy, just on the basis of this social paradigm. It doesn't have to do, I mean, there are people who die inauthentic lives because their whole life is consumed with survival or like war. But there are other people who go their whole lives being inauthentic because they've never done the inward turn of actually understanding what it is that they value. They are just sort of this mirrored reflection of their parents and then their peers and broader society. And the trends of life just bring them further and further away from who they are. It becomes habitual. But the other dynamic underneath that is that if you remember, the earlier dynamic of parent to child is the reason why the child changes themselves is in order to secure love and care so that they can survive. This means that implicit within that power dynamic is the threat of death. There is a threat that if I do not conform, again implicitly, if I do not conform enough to get my parents' love and care, I will die. There is a death threat to a pure authenticity. Even if the parents aren't being explicit about it, so sometimes they have been, especially historically, and even if the child is not explicitly aware of it, there is still this death threat that is underneath it. Later on in their peer socialization, it feels very similar. Their success in their peer socialization depends on the degree to which they can conform. And then later on, in adulthood, much of your survival depends on peer socialization. Not as much and not as intensely as when you were a child, but that same feeling carries on and reinforces the reluctance to explore the authentic self, because the authentic self from the earliest ages is associated with death. It's associated with the death threat. That is where the fear of authenticity comes from. And it's reinforced in later stages of inauthenticity. And not only that, but there is actually a real existential threat to authenticity, or existential threat of authenticity. We're tribal creatures. And so just on a social adult level, historically, if you were out of step with your tribe in a significant way, regardless of whether what you were doing was actually good or bad, I mean, you could be killed, or you could be, if you upset the people, if you offended the people around you, even if you didn't do anything that was innately good or bad, in the tribes, back in the day, they could just ostracize you. And when being ostracized, you would die, right? Now, ostracization today doesn't carry that same kind of death threat as much. because individuals are able to sort of survive on their own, regardless of sort of what society thinks about them, which is a step forward in progress in terms of the freedom to be authentic. But back in the day, it wasn't the case. To be ostracized meant death. And again, as adults, we carry that same psychoevolutionary history that begins in childhood. When we try to be authentic in the face of society, in the face of our peers, in the face of the people around us, underneath that, the reason why there's so much fear underneath that is because historically there's actually been a death threat to that. And arguably, you could say, especially depending on where in society you live or what your values are, whoever you authentically are, there is an actual threat of death. I mean, this is something we've seen in the LGBTQ plus community where um, e- even today, an authentic expression of one's sexuality or one's sexual preferences can threaten your life. And 50 years ago, you might have actually had a really, really good chance of dying if you were openly authentic about what it is that you preferred sexually. And again, today there are countries and cultures where if you are open about who you actually are, then your life will be threatened. And so this actually short circuits even the exploration of authenticity in the first place, right? If you're a teenager and you live in a country where any sort of LGBTQ expression is considered immoral, or you'll get stoned to death or killed in some way, and maybe the very first instinctual impulses towards that value come up as a teenager, right? You see a guy and you're attracted to him, right? And you're a guy. You're gonna shut down that exploration before even probably thinking about it, because you know that there is a social threat to that authentic expression. But that permeates not just with sexual preferences, but with all kinds of preferences, even if there is no actual threat, though it's stronger when there is one. But even if there is no actual threat, the very act of being authentic itself triggers that fear response and that avoidance response, because it is so strongly associated with death and with the threat of death. And so beyond the existential limits, beyond the need for survival, there is simply the psychological burden that we carry that seems to be, for all intents and purposes, unescapable at the current time, where there is just a sort of strong, so socially innate avoidance of authenticity and the exploration of authenticity, never mind the actual embodiment of one's authentic values, because it carries the innate threat of death with it. Now, what's the problem with that, right? Well, the problem with that is that all of your meaning and your happiness and your joy and your contentment and things that matter in life to an individual are wrapped up in what they actually authentically value. And so the degree to which they are not actually able to embody or explore that authentic self because of this death threat in society is a degree to which their life is meaningless and listless and empty. And what you find is that many people, they spend their entire lives chasing values which are socially approved or peer approved or parent approved, or maybe just a negative reaction um, to parents. I mean, you can also develop a personality that it's inauthentic, not because it embodies the values that you were forced to take on, but because it purposely embodies the negative values of what you took on. So you don't value them innately, but you value them because they are symbolic of your rebellion against whoever it is that, or whatever it is that you're rebelling against. But what you have is, again, this situation where people are putting themselves into all kinds of values that have nothing to do with what they actually value, and spending all their time and resources and energy and years and years pursuing all of these empty things that aren't going to bring them happiness and aren't going to bring them fulfillment or meaning or the truth of themselves, because the actual authentic exploration is a threat to their life psychologically. And this is principally where the things like depression and anxiety come from. I'm compressing this dramatically, right? And there's so many individual variations to this, but this is where a lot of this kind of stuff comes from. You repress your authentic values. You try to get meaning and happiness from any other kind of value, socially approved ones, or as a reaction to it, or things, anything other than what you authentically value. You try to get value out of. You pour yourself and all your energy and all your time into it, and every single thing that you do just ends up making you feel empty or not actually being what makes of value to you, because you have a psychological incentive to stay away from your own authentic values. And then for a lot of people, they do this their entire lives. They end up 45 and they don't know what the point of their life is, right? They don't know what they've accomplished with their life, or they try to get this kind of, they try to get this secondhand meaning from things that the people around them have told them is meaningful. Or they've just sort of justified to themselves is meaningful without actually having the real experience of meaning and the real experience of value in their own being, validated through their own being. And so this is probably, one of the biggest burdens on authenticity today, especially in the West, especially in societies where problems like survival are significantly solved compared to other places, and where people have a lot more freedom. Because what is the point in places where people have a lot of freedom? What is the point of freedom if it can't be used to act for the sake of what I actually value? Then freedom is empty. I think one of the reasons why you see the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and mental health issues in Western free countries is, in some sense, precisely because they don't have the distractions of survival that give them this sort of baseline meaning. So they have all this freedom, but they can't actually use that freedom to pursue authentic values. So they use that freedom to pursue inauthentic values, and then they feel empty and pointless and meaningless. And they lack joy in living because they're not ever actually able to experience things that have genuine value to them. At least that's my hypothesis. And it is all related back to this relationship between parent and child, this seed of inauthenticity that neither the parent nor the child has much control over. And so I think I'm going to leave it. I think I'm going to leave it there, because we're at about 50 minutes here, and the next conversation that this gets into is the state and the relationship of the state to citizens, and how it relates, how it mimics often the relationship between the parent and child, and adds another kind of layer to this blocking of inauthenticity. So yeah, I think I'm just going to leave it here for today, and in the next video we'll pick up with a discussion of the state. But again, I really appreciate it if you've gotten this far, sticking through and just listening to this. This is one of the more fundamental blocks to personal authenticity. And I think more importantly, it is the individually sided focus of that inauthenticity. It is the thing that blocks the internal exploration of what one values. Whereas when we get into the conversation of the state, that's more of the external block of authenticity. And so this dynamic is at the very least something that each individual can explore. And I would say if this was the only block you kind of were able to listen to, that you could get so much value out of this in and of itself, because the freedom of the West in particular allows for so much external authenticity, even with the presence of the state, that if we could simply unlock the internal authenticity, you could gain so much more meaning and purpose simply out of that. Whereas even if we abolished the state, more freedom is not going to matter if you can't use that freedom to access who you authentically are. If you can't act out who you authentically are, because the threat of death, the psychological threat of death, is still strongly tied with authenticity. So anyway, thank you again. Thank you for sticking this far, if you stick this far, and we'll talk to you next time.